Hey there, students. This is Mr. Phillips, and today is the fourth episode of my top 5 lit list for John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men. Just sit back and relax. Let's talk about the top 5 things I think you should know from chapters 4, 5, and 6. Let's do this. Starting things off, let's talk about me for a moment. Now, I know the music is sad, but I've got a life update that is very, very not sad. So I'm recording this on 2 days before my wife's due date. So hopefully you'll be getting an update soon on how things went at the hospital. If you need me, I'll still be available during my office hours. Just know that I might be helping my wife deal with the newborn. I'm still going to help you get the year done right, but I may have my hands full from time to time. I'm so excited to share that with you, so just stay tuned. That sums it up pretty well, so let's get into the latest reading, chapters 4, 5, and 6, the last chapters of Mice and Men. First on the list, number 5. At number 5, I gotta say that this is a unique ending. It's one of the most unique endings to a novel that I've ever read for a couple reasons. Now, when you think about our culture, we enjoy the end of a show, a book, a movie that is happy. It's like the Disneyland happy endings of any kind of story. We tend to want to leave a book or a tale feeling good, right? And usually that is because the conflict is resolved. We're talking about the resolution of the conflict. And when you get to this resolution at the end, where kind of all things are over and it's an ending, it's a sad ending. But my question that I want us to think about as we go through this episode is, what was resolved? Which conflict was resolved? I know we talked a little bit about Lenny and George had a dream to own land. How was that resolved? A book about friendship during the Depression. How was that resolved? We're going to take a close look and break down a little bit of each chapter to figure out, okay, what is the conflict and how has it resolved? So number 5, just simple and saying, wow, what a unique ending. Number 4. At number 4, we're going to take a look at chapter 4. So chapter 4, I like to title this kind of Outcasts. And we see Crooks, Lenny, and Candy as outcasts all coming together in Crooks's room or the stable. Now there's another outcast we'll talk about, but as Lenny meets Crooks, we get to see 2 outcasts in a different way. And then when Candy joins them, right? And then when Curly's wife joins them, they're all outcasts in their own right. And chapter 4 explores the power between the outcasts. So we're going to do a little power dynamics work here, and we're going to rank them from least powerful to the most powerful. And the least powerful of the outcasts, I would argue, is Crooks. He's the lowest on the totem pole simply because, and it's very clear when Curly's wife basically threatens to get him lynched, right, is because he is a black man and he has the lowest social power of them all. He's by himself. He seems to be, the only one. He doesn't talk to anybody, unless it's work related. He reads a lot and he just has the lowest amount of power. And so even when Lenny comes in to talk to him, he is like, why are you coming to talk to me? I don't really have a lot of people coming to talk. He's already on the defense when Lenny comes in. Speaking of Lenny, he's the second lowest with the amount of power that he has. Lenny is pretty low on the power because he just doesn't know any better. The one thing that he has is physical force, but he at least doesn't just go, hurting people. It's really when he's told to do something, he does it. That's what makes him a good worker, but that also makes him very weak in a power dynamics sense. So even though that Lenny comes into Crooks Crooks is like, wow, this guy is an outcast. He doesn't have much power like me. It's okay to talk to him. Then Candy comes in, and Candy and Lenny and Crooks are all alone because all the other guys, George included, mind you, have gone into town to kind of spend their money over the weekend to, have a drink or see a lady or whatever it is. And these outcasts kind of get together and have a conversation. Now, above Candy is Curly's wife. Curly's wife is above Candy. And Curly's wife is at that spot because while Candy has the brains, Curly's wife has the power to the boss. She's connected. And what she says can oftentimes trump the other guys because they are so low, and she knows this. And she shows it. She kind of flexes when Crooks tries to tell her to leave. She really threatens him. And I've already said that. But as far as power dynamics, that's what chapter 4 to me is about, is those outcasts coming together. And when the others return, all 4 of them disperse, and we kind of get an interesting picture of what outcasts might do, right, when no one else is around. And as far as the conflict of the play or of the book, it was made into a play, but of this book, we see something about outcasts and the power that others have over those who don't have as much power. So maybe that has something to do with the conflict. We'll talk about that. But at number 4, we have outcasts. Number 3. At number 3, we have chapter 5, Lenny's thoughts. A lot to talk about in this chapter. I'm going to stick to what I think is relevant to the overall conflict. So let's set that up. He's in the barn. He's upset, and Lenny is, because he killed his puppy after it bit him. It was an accident. And all he wants to do is he's thinking about hiding it and getting rid of the guilt that he feels and the fear that he has of George being mad at him. Now, George obviously knows that it's not good to accidentally even kill, and he's torn. George is torn always because he knows that it makes Lenny happy, but Lenny tends to accidentally kill the thing that makes him happy. So as Lenny is hiding and feeling this guilt and shame and fear, Curly's wife comes in. This escalates the situation. Lenny knows not to talk to her, and he wants not to be more in trouble, more guilty. So he's even more afraid. But she persists. She breaks down his walls for company. She herself, an outcast, is lonely for a friend who is just nice to her. And if Lenny is anything, he is nice. Even though he is lamenting and sad about his badness, he's still a nice guy. And she sees that and can take advantage of that, right? Because she just wants a friend. So as she's breaking down his walls, they get a little closer. They sit next to each other. She's making him feel better about himself. She's kind of trying to cheer him up by, asking about his interests. And he mentions he likes soft things. And she says her hair is really soft. Would you like to touch it? And then he's not thinking straight. She's not thinking straight. She doesn't really know what's going to happen. And he starts kind of petting her hair. And after a little while, she gets nervous because his hand, gets caught in the hair. And she starts getting fidgety, and he's trying to calm her down. And she's about to scream, and he covers her mouth. And, push comes to shove. He's just trying to shush her because he's afraid of being in more trouble. And he accidentally kills her, which is exactly what he did with the puppy. It's exactly what he did with the mice. And now he's covering up something that's a little more troublesome and harder to cover up: a person. You can cover up a mouse, you can cover up a dead puppy, but you really can't cover up a person. And he knows that this is really bad. And so he leaves. He goes to where George told him because he knows there's going to be trouble. And Candy's first on the scene. He gets George. They talk about it, what to do before Candy goes and alerts the men to basically what is this accidental murder. And the conflict all of a sudden is pointed towards Lenny and accidents and not intending to do something. And is it his fault? And this is where we get to the heart of this story a lot of the times. But let me save that for the next 2 points. The third is chapter 5, Lenny's thoughts. number 2. Wow, this is definitely a lot to think through, and it's tough to talk through. But at number 2, I'm talking about chapter 6, and I'm going to reference back to the beginning, that meeting place where George and Lenny, we first meet them, and George told Lenny, go here if there's trouble. That place. And we really see a clear picture in this section of Lenny's torment. So really, number 2 is Lenny's torment. And we see that he is tormented. He is guilty. He's guilt-ridden. He's talking to himself, and he's pulling voices, from his head that his Aunt Clara might say that he's going to leave you. We see the connection he has with George is so strong that he really isn't feeling terrible about Curly's wife. He didn't know her, but he's really feeling terrible about him making things hard for George and always messing things up. And when George comes, we see them try to go with their normal coping pattern, which is George giving Lenny a hard time for doing something bad, and Lenny kind of trying to make it up to George. However, this time is different, and George knows this. No, he knows this, but Lenny doesn't, because he doesn't know, right? He thinks they're going to escape. And Lenny makes George make it feel normal. He says, come on, George, why don't you just tell me how bad I am, just like the old times? And so as he's doing this, George is like, it's okay. He's like, Lenny says, no, George, it's not okay. You need to be mad at me like normal, right? That habitual comforting pattern. And so as we see what happens, right, George is trying to act normal so that Lenny can feel good and feel calm and not be tormented. And, of course, George shoots and kills Lenny. It's a painless death, and we'll get into that in number 1. But what I want to bridge that with is what Slim says. He says, you had to do it, George. You had to. And he's trying to commiserate with George, and they're going to go get a drink and hopefully talk through this. And we'll talk more about that in point 1. But as far as the conflict of what is being resolved at the end, right? George finally having his problems go away. I would say that's what's being resolved. George is now free to actually work toward his dream. But his dream is also dead with Lenny. And so essentially killing his dream to be with Lenny on his farm, George is now a new man. And there's always conflict when you have kind of a rebirth of a character. And that's what I think is going on here. George is coming out of one part of life, having to end one dream and hopefully start another. So I called number 2, chapter 6, back to the beginning. George is at a beginning of his life without Lenny. That's my second thing on this list. Finally, number 1 on my list this week. Number 1, we have ethics. There's so much to talk about here. I'm not sure how I'm supposed to do this, so I'm just going to cram it all in and see where it takes you. So ethics and the field and study of ethics and morals is to basically study how people act in according with rules of conduct, or like a set of beliefs, or how they reflect on moral issues. And morals are like the rules by people should live by, the rules by which people should live. Okay. Now, when you think about what George had to do, he clearly felt morally responsible for what happens to Lenny. And one thing, he had a freedom of action. No one was forcing him to do this. And so he made a choice because he felt morally responsible. Now, you might think George should have killed Lenny or he shouldn't have killed Lenny, but let me help you think through that a little bit. There are 3 things that you might say. This act is morally permissible, this act is morally obligatory, or this act is morally supererogatory. Now, I might not be saying that right because it's a long word, but the first one, morally permissible, right? Whether you think it's he should or should not kill Lenny, you believe that he is not morally guilty for doing so. Now, right off the bat, I think, yes, George is not morally guilty for doing this. You might have a different opinion. You might think that he has the second one, which is a moral obligation to either kill Lenny or not to kill Lenny. If you think he shouldn't have killed Lenny, right, you would think that this is a morally obligatory situation where you don't kill Lenny, right? I think he probably did have either the permission to do either one and not be morally guilty, or he should have definitely done the right thing and killed Lenny, because Lenny is already tormented. He's already suffering, and he's going to suffer more. You know that if Curly gets his hands on him. So this is why I think instead of just permissible or obligatory, we have a moral supererogatory situation here, because that word means the situation produces good that goes beyond what duty demands. I don't think it's demanded on anyone to do what George did for Lenny. He kills Lenny because it saved him extra and unnecessary torment that we know is coming. So I think when you say, is this an ethical thing or a moral thing, I would argue that this would be a morally supererogatory moment where George goes beyond what any normal human should be expected to do. That's a lot of ethics talk, but if that's interesting to you, right, morally permissible, morally obligatory, or morally supererogatory, it just gives you words to talk about the situation with a little more clarity. So, at number 1, I try to keep it as short as I could. We have ethics. It is time for the call to action. All this talk about ethics and the somber mood of this episode is something that we're gonna just encounter. We can apply that to our real world in lots of ways, but I'm curious, how do you see this ethical dilemma, these ethical conflicts that come up in the real world? Maybe that has something to do with Corona. Maybe that has something to do with just normal life. But hopefully you filled out the Google survey and you are adding to the conversation. Since this is the last one of this season, if you would, the last podcast for Of Mice and Men. Sorry it's a little long, but thank you so much for listening. Hopefully it gave you a little bit to think about. As always, you can feel free to email me and we'll set up an appointment, or come see me during my office hours. You better come between the hours of 3 and 3:15, or else I'm not going to be there anymore. Thank you so much for listening, and as always, have a great day.